In the previous segment, I mentioned Acts chapter 1 as being a particular verse that highlights the importance of the interpretive journey and thinking about author intent. But it also gives us an understanding as to how to be Christ-centered. In that particular verse, you would ask yourself, what does this passage or what does this set of verses tell me about the person or work of Christ? In Acts chapter 1, verse 8, we learn that Christ is wanting us to be witnesses to people who are similar to us, people that we have lots of things in common with, but we also need to be witnesses to people who are very different than us, people that have different theology, different ideology. And in fact, we want to be proactive in preaching the gospel and demonstrating the gospel to those that we may call our enemies, or that our culture would say we have the right to label enemies. I think this teaches us much about who Jesus is, that Jesus transcends culture. Jesus transcends division. That the thing that Jesus has ushered into our lives, this gospel story, this new kingdom, this royal family, transcends the divisions and cultural divides that we typically want to prop up between one another. If I'm preaching through Acts chapter 1, I want to call out what the original audience would have understood. I want to apply that to my people. But then I want to also make very clear, I want to highlight, this teaches us that Jesus transcends divisions. We as humans so frequently want to prop up our divisions. We want to push people away. We want to find reasons to sort of draw lines and say, this is our team and that's your team. We're going to do what we want to do and you do you. We find ways, and quite frequently as humans, we have the propensity to want to divide from other humans. And Jesus is telling us that the gospel demands that we proactively unify ourselves with others, that we seek to proactively bridge the chasms, to lessen the gaps between ourselves and other peoples. Jesus, his work, his death, his resurrection make possible for people to be united. Jesus is above all of those things. Understanding Acts chapter 1 gives us insight into who Jesus is and what he did. In my sermon, I'd want to take a moment and talk about how Jesus bridges people. He brings people together, and he is able to transcend any division. Listen, in our lives, we have division. We have people that have hurt us. We have people that have done things to fracture friendships. But the reality is, the gospel is big enough to reconcile every relationship. If I were preaching through Acts chapter 1, I would want to challenge my people to know that Jesus has the power to reconcile any relationship, no matter what has happened, and that we as believers are called to proactively demonstrate what Christ can do in those particular situations. Being Christ-centered is about taking that passage and highlighting what specific things in that passage cause us to recognize lessons about Jesus, his work, his personality, his redemption. Another thing from Acts chapter 1 that helps us understand a little more about the work and person of Jesus is the fact that Jesus is telling them to go into all the world. What we learn about the work of Jesus is that the cross wasn't just for Jewish people. The cross wasn't just for a few people or a particular type of demographic. That the cross applies to people from all people groups on planet Earth. That the cross transcends culture. That the cross transcends region. The cross is for all peoples. All people groups everywhere are impacted by the power of the cross. Whenever I'm preaching through a particular passage, I want to take moments to pause, to highlight, to extrapolate, pull out the specific things that we learn about the person and work of Christ. Highlight them for our people. Don't assume that your audience is going to pick up on those things naturally. Most people don't. It's your responsibility as the preacher to make sure you pull those things out, put them on display for your audience.